lounging, son.
I taught myself a bit how to read by looking at comic books and the pictures supporting the words and the words supporting the pictures.
Yeah, that's how I learned.
My mom once, I said, how come you were buying me all these comics? Certainly you heard that they were going to turn your kid into a juvenile delinquent or a sex pervert or just an idiot. I said, why didn't you know that? She goes, oh yeah. I said, then why did you get them for me? Were you trying to create a fiend? She kind of rolled her eyes and she just said, all we know was you really seem to need them bad. It's like, oh, I still do.
Yeah, same here. I know exactly what you're saying. Let's get into the interview. I want to, first off, to everybody listening, I want to welcome you guys to another episode of the Comic Lounge. I have cartoonist Scott Shaw, who, I mean, you were an artist on one of my earliest comics. You're talking about learning how to read from comics. You drew a Sonic the Hedgehog comic one of my first, and your name, your signature, the way you would sign your books, that cover has always stuck out in my mind, and it's like embedded in my skull. That's why, like, when I started working at the shop, which is where you shop, I was doing pulls and I was like, Scott Shaw. I was like, there's no way that it's him. And then you came in and I even asked Nick, I was like, dude, is he the cartoonist? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, oh dude, I gotta talk to him. And I was like, I don't want to bother him.
Asshole.
Yeah, I was like, I don't want to be a dick. I don't want to annoy him. So, anyways though, I'm really glad you decided to do this with me. It's nice to be able to chat with you. I don't get to really.
I love doing this sort of thing because, I mean, obviously, it's not going to be, some fantastic big revelation to the world. I mean, I'm not a big important cartoonist, but I'm still a working cartoonist, and I've got a lot of funny stories. So
yeah, and that's what I'm hoping to hear today from you. I'm hoping here. I mean, I think we talked briefly when I first met you at the shop. I think I did tell you a little bit about Sonic, and you kind of gave me some stories about that. And ever since then, I'm like, man, I want to find out a little bit more. So you were one of the first people I thought of when I started the YouTube channel a couple months ago, and I'm really glad we were able to kind of like set something up. You talked about it briefly, like that's how you learned how to read was comic books. What were some of the first comic books that really like flipped that switch in you to where you're like, oh man, I love these things?
Back then, a basic gift that you got usually from a relative, an aunt or a grandparent, was a subscription to Walt Disney's Comics and Stories. It was just a given. And if you didn't have one, there was one at your dentist's office or your, pediatrician's office. I mean, they were everywhere. And those comics were selling like over 6 million copies every issue. Yeah. So that kind of explains it. It was like having Walt Disney's name on the cover was like it was with videos. Parents were like, oh, well, this must be okay. Mm-hmm. And so I was reading a lot of the Carl Barks stuff, which that really got me excited. I had no idea who he was. I didn't know I'd be meeting him, be his friend, 30 years later. Mm-hmm. But his storytelling, it really knocked me out. I loved Little Archie by Bob Bowling. I loved Sugar and Spike, Sheldon Mayer stuff. But before that, he did a strip called The Three Mouseketeers. I guess they created it to rival the Disney Mouseketeers. I'm trying to think of some of the other stuff. I liked, Mighty Mouse, all the funny animal stuff. And when I think the real turning point was when I was in the hospital, probably heading towards 6 years old, not quite. It was kind of, and I've talked to a lot of other people online my age, and they've had similar experiences. When you're an only child like me, and suddenly back then it was like a 2 or 3 day stay at the hospital. Mm-hmm. They were always promising you all the free ice cream you want. Well, who cares about ice cream? I'm an only child here among all these kids that I don't know, and I'm already a weirdo. It's like I don't even know how to talk to them. And I remember my parents came to see me that first day, and in my mind's eye, my dad, I just happen to have these because I've been scanning them, but it looked like he brought in like a stack this big of comics. Now, it probably was maybe a dozen comics, a half a dozen comics, but to me it was like, oh man, you can cut my head off and I'll take all these, you know, whatever they need now. And it had all the comics. Oh, Dennis the Menace was another one I really liked because I liked the art of a guy named Al Weisman. And but there was it was all those sort of funny books, and that's what they called them then, and that's what I like calling them now, just to shave a little bit of the pretension off of them, because they're still for kids, just 40-year-old kids now. That's a big difference. Yeah. But he brought those to me, and in the middle of it was an issue of Superboy. And I'd never seen Superboy, and I wasn't a sports fan, but the cover was Superboy as the one-man baseball team. So it had him like in every position on the field. And I was just like, what the hell is this? And that was the first time I really kind of had an experience that DC milked like no other publisher of, let's put something on the cover that requires an explanation. And it worked. It always worked with me. That's why I love all that Silver Age DC stuff. It's not because it's necessarily good work, but they really knew how to just go, okay, you're gonna read this, kid. Where's that dime? Or even worse, where's that 12 cents? To guys my age, that was like a big turning point where you had to learn math, because suddenly those extra 2 pennies were driving you out of your mind. But anyway, seeing that Superboy comic, you know, made me more curious about, you know, the big boy comics. Yeah. And I think that's why, and kind of, again, I think for guys my age, it was kind of that normal slide. You go from the funny stuff, and then you go to the Mort Weisinger Superman stuff, which if you ever take a look at those things, Mort Weisinger is notoriously probably the biggest son of a bitch editor in the history of comics. He mistreated everyone that worked for him. However, he was a smart editor because he knew how to make these things so easy for kids to get into. You take a look at your typical Superboy comic from the early 60s, or an issue of Adventure Comics, even better, because that had like 3 or 4 features. Every panel, it not only shows you what's going on, like Superman's flying to his Fortress of Solitude, then you see it in the distance, and with the big stupid arrow-shaped key next to it. Yeah. and then in the caption, he's thinking, it says, you know, soon Superman is heading to his Fortress of Solitude. And then he's thinking, when I get to the Fortress of Solitude, I'll be able to finally solve this mystery. And it's like, they're showing it to you and then telling you what it is 2 different ways. Which was not unlike pulp magazines, by the way. Pulp magazines were written by the word. And when I started reading Doc Savage when I was a kid, it's like, this is really overwritten. I get it. You don't have to tell me 3 times. Turned out that's what editors allowed, because their writers were getting paid by the word. So they needed to pad it anyway. So the editor said, well, look, give it one description that a kid would understand, one description that an kind of illiterate adult would understand, and then give one that like an actual reader would understand. And if you ever read like an issue of Doc Savage, The Shadow, from the old pulp magazines, that's one of the things I really enjoy about reading those things, is you see how artificially they were made, and yet all that stuff was the basis that comics were constructed on top of.
Right.
You know, and the funniest thing is they had characters where the heroes were killing people right and left, and they weren't nearly as creepy as comics are now.
Yeah.
And the Shadow enjoyed knocking people off. It was like, oh, he's a Shadow. That's cool. Yeah. Doc Savage had brain surgery done on the villains. It's like, oh, now they'll be good people. And he really did. It's like you read those and go, man, this is as nutty as Dick Tracy.
Yeah, I really want to read those now. I haven't read any of those like old school ones. I mean, I have read like stories of those characters, more modern takes, But now I want to check out the old stuff for sure.
I'll recommend a couple of them for you because you're reading them and your jaw's like dropped. And not a, the unfortunate thing is there's a significant amount of just casual racism in those things as there were. There is a guy now named Doug Murray who's writing new Doc Savage, new Tarzan, he's got a new one coming out called Tarzan meets John Carter. But he can write in that pulp style and it's still corny as hell, but he removes all that, problem stuff. Yeah. So those are real. You probably would enjoy one of those more than anything because you're not. What the hell's going on here?
Yeah, I'll check those out for sure. And you began selling your art at a young age, if my research is correct, at around like 16. Were you selling your own art already?
Actually, I was selling it by 5th grade.
Dang, that's crazy.
Well, I would. Kids would take a brown paper bag and they'd cut it up and they'd make a book cover for their school book.
Oh, I remember. Yeah, I remember doing that when I was a kid too.
And kids would want me to draw on it because I was the class cartoonist. So I would, at home, I was practicing. I could draw the Flintstones. I could draw monster characters. I could draw surfer characters. Mostly stuff I'd copied from other people, but I learned the formulas. So, and I would charge 3 cents for a head or a nickel for the whole body. And that's how I could afford to buy more comics for myself. Because my parents were, my dad was an officer in the Navy, but it wasn't like he was making a lot of money. We were fine, but it wasn't, I didn't, I had to cajole my parents constantly for funny book money.
Yeah, me too.
Finally, I had kind of a slight income, so it's like, hey, what I'd do is I wouldn't tell them, and I'd say, hey, I need money for these. Well, okay. And then I'd buy myself some more on the way home from school. I didn't know it, by the way, but my dad he never said a thing about this, but he had a great interest in lettering. And he taught me how to letter with a speedball pen when I was about 6 or 7. He kept saying, this will be important for school. But in talking to some friends of his at his funeral, actually, these guys said, well, didn't you know that your old man liked to draw? And I said, well, yeah, he did those paint by numbers, and he did all these, Christmas decorations blown up on plywood. And suddenly it all came together. And he came from a little town, it's not so little anymore, Decatur, Illinois, and I'm sure he would have been a sign painter. If he had that much interest, you couldn't have been a professional artist, but you could have been a sign painter. So that's kind of the secret origin I never knew about, because that's, I think, why my dad put up with me liking comics. He'd call it foolishness sometimes because he was a Depression era kid, and he kind of thought, I wanted to do that and it didn't work out. Maybe you're not going to be able to make it work out either. And he knew I had heroes, like Dr. Seuss was my first big hero, and the other was Roy Chapman Andrews, who wrote all the books about dinosaurs. But then it went on. The biggest one that they dealt with in their own way was Big Daddy Roth, because here was a guy that was not that much younger than my dad, but he was like representing the counterculture. And my dad was a very good guy, but and he wasn't particularly conservative, but the whole hippie thing and beatniks and stuff, he wasn't exactly ready for that. I was like, I'm like 9 years old, and I'm like I'm going to Halloween as a beatnik. It's like, I like beatniks. They're looking at me like, what the hell?
So is it safe to say then, once you saw that money flowing in just from like drawing on book covers, is that when you were like, this is what I want to do? I want to be a cartoonist professionally.
I think I'd wanted to do that even before I got anything. And I think that most cartoonists really feel that way. And by cartoonists, I don't just mean guys that draw funny stuff. Frank Miller's a cartoonist. The actual definition of the word cartoonist means somebody that writes and draws, that
Right.
make their own stories. And I'm not putting down guys that don't write their own stuff, but you know, that was something. That's something that was always important to me.
So who were, I mean, you talked about some of your first comics. Who were would you say were the biggest influences?
Karl Barks, certainly. And well, Jack Kirby, I guess, would be the next big one. And Bob Bowling's Our Little Archie was a big influence on my writing, because he kind of had a gravitas even to the funny stuff. There was always kind of a little bittersweet moment or something in it that even as a kid it was like, God, I never see this in any other comic. Oh, I really liked John Stanley, the guy that did Little Lulu.
Okay.
Wrote it. Yeah, that was another big influence. And then I started getting into the other kinds of comics, and it was kind of Jack Kirby or nobody.
Yeah.
And I would say Jack is one of my two biggest influences, not only because of his comics, but because I knew him pretty well, and he was a really good guy.
Oh man,
Like
I'm so jealous you got to meet him. I know him and stuff.
I'm not bragging, but I mean, we'd go to the house and hang out. We'd go there and swim. I mean, it was, the Kirbys were incredibly generous to people. And I always used to say, I'm really glad Charlie Manson never showed up at his house, because they would have said, oh, come on in, you know. But there's a fairly famous photo of Frank Frank Zappa with Jack at his home. And I think Frank lived in the neighborhood. But
wow.
Jack was, that was the interesting thing. And I always like to mentally compare him was, my dad wasn't like a maniac, you know, right-wing guy that hated Asians after the war. His ship had been sunk, by the way, so a lot of guys did carry that kind of hatred. My dad wasn't like that at all. But seeing Jack enjoy stuff like the Forever People, where they're essentially super hippies, and, you know, he told me he liked underground comics once. There's a story, remind me about this. But I mean, everything about him, other than being a guy from the Depression and a smart guy, was there. Even though they were both good guys, Jack was like completely in another dimension than my father. So it really was an impression on me. It's like, you know, you can be a good guy. You don't have to be a complete weirdo, but you can still be a weirdo too.
Yeah.
I once asked Jack. I said, it was the first time I met him, and I said, please don't be offended, but what is it like to be admired by nothing but weirdos? He started laughing, and I'm a weirdo too. Yeah. And it was like, of course he was, because we kind of always have the attitude that, oh, we're the ones that discovered this. But, yeah, you know, I'm very lucky in that I knew some of those guys that didn't have anything as a inspiration beyond the comic strips and pulp magazines. Mm-hmm. So they were actually the guys that were foundation of all the tricks we know in storytelling in comics. And, you know, other than Bob Kane, none of those guys or women acted like they had anything to prove. They were all very nice and very generous with their time. And I think between being in high school with a bunch of my weirdo friends and having that kind of support back and forth, and then most of them and I were involved very heavily in starting Comic-Con. So that meant we got to meet more professionals. And, you know, and then I worked in a comic book store after that when I moved to Los Angeles. And then I was meeting people coming in that were in the business. Mm-hmm. So it was, I think Bob Kane was the only really stinky guy I ever met, and I'm not alone. So
yeah, I mean, this isn't the first time I've heard comments about Bob Kane.
I was working in the American Comic Book Company. I was the manager of the store in Studio City on Ventura. Mm-hmm. And this guy comes in. You know, I mean, back then it was mostly you know, obsessive fans. Most people didn't have a casual interest in comics like they do now. And he was like wearing a suit and comes in. He's kind of strutting around, and it was a small little place up there. And he says, "Well," he goes, I bet you're very excited to meet me because my name's Bob Kane." And I'm like, well, he's not very funny, but yeah, I like Bob Kane. I like old Batman comics. And we talked for a little bit, and I made the mistake of saying, my favorite Batman stories of yours are the ones that you did with Dick Sprang. And he goes, "Who's Dick Sprang?" And this was like 75 or 76. So, I mean, it wasn't some inside thing at all.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just really fighting it off. And I thought, man, you know, it's like, well, of course, comics have never been kind to, you know, the guys that get noticed usually aren't that kind to their co-creators, but he was a masterpiece of just going, yeah. And I mean, the stories continue forever, but
Right, yeah. I mean, it still goes on to this day. So, you know, I mean, I know he gets the recognition now, but just to see not just Jack, but we saw Siegel and Schuster, you know, the same way. You know, you just kept seeing it. Bill Finger, same way. And you just see all these co-creators like where they just don't get the recognition. Steve Ditko. You ask the average person who created Spider-Man, and they're not going to say Steve Ditko in that sentence. They're only going to say Stan Lee, and I think that that's a huge crime. Same with Jack Kirby. Most people don't know Jack Kirby's name either. The average person seeing these
movies.
movies.
With animation.
Yeah.
I mean, Walt Disney at least had his name on the company, but the other guy that most people mention is Chuck Jones.
Mm-hmm.
And Chuck Jones pulled a Stan Lee too, where he would never mention the people working with him, and he'd always make himself available for interviews. And he started being more and more of a caricature of himself, kind of like Stan. So that got more interviews because, hey, this guy's kind of a character, you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, I certainly have been accused of marketing myself in you know, that exclamation point alone at one time. Everybody's like, who the hell does he think he is doing that? I was like, well, it's because I like comics, you know? That's what they always, every sentence ended with that or a question mark. I'm not going to put a question mark after my name.
Yeah.
I don't think it was me. I think it was Mike Wieringo doing it. But now it seems like a third of the kids out there doing comic sign with an exclamation point.
Yeah. Oh, man.
I actually have gotten jobs due to the exclamation point. I remember somebody came to me, and I mean, it was a big job too, and they said, we couldn't remember your name, so we asked around for the guy with the exclamation point, and then we found you.
That's hilarious. I mean, that always stuck out in my mind.
I started doing that when I was 11 years old, so it wasn't like, yeah, I have to market myself. I need to increase my brand, you know, recognition. Yeah. It wasn't anything like that.
Yeah, that's funny. You said Ringo. I forgot that Ringo did the exclamation mark. He actually drew the first comic book I ever read, which was a Flash comic, which is pretty crazy.
Terrific because he had. It felt modern, but there was that kind of clarity that you had in Silver Age comics.
Yeah, I mean, it was
and the characters all appealing.
Yeah.
That's a missing thing in so much stuff now, is that they're just not appealing.
Yeah. I completely
agree. I understand it has something to do with my age and my taste, but I've been scanning a bunch of 1990s issues of What If just for the covers.
Mm-hmm.
And the covers sometimes are okay, and I open them up, and it's like, I never heard of this guy before, and I never heard of him again. I don't know who did this, but I don't want to read this again. The cover looks fascinating, but that's where it ends. You know?
Yeah. So I wanted to jump back a couple. You said something about the underground comics that you wanted me to remind you about. So.
Oh yeah, with Jack. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jack said that he liked underground comics. Now I was 18, so I took him at his word,
mm-hmm.
and I went back in my dorm room. No, it wasn't my dorm. I was living in a home with 5 or 6 other guys. It was like Animal House, and I drew this poster. I mean, it was big. It was like 11 by 17 poster based on an old comic by Jack. It was one of those pre-Hero Marvels. It was an issue of Strange Tales. And I changed it to Deranged Tales. And there's this big monster who's like posing with his arms up in the middle of an arena. And he's going, "No human can beat me." So I just added a little extra appendage. And he's saying, "No human can beat me off." And I mean, this schlong is big. This schlong is as big as he is. And veiny. And, you know, I mean, and then I sign at the bottom, "After Jack Kirby signed Scott Shaw." And I mean, it's not just a sketch. I worked really hard to make this thing good. To Jack, I think it's like, okay, he likes underground comics, well, he'll think this is funny, you know?
Mm.
Well, it may have been the fact, too, that not only did I not show him the original, a friend of mine had 1,000 copies printed. I don't understand why, but you could ask him. He runs the San Diego Comic Fest now. Anyway, I took it to Jack, and I've never seen Jack like searching for words. He was just so kind of like, you know, what the hell was going on here? And he explained, he said, "No, when I said I liked underground comics, it was because everybody could sign their name to their stuff. Nobody had to work with somebody they didn't want to work with. He said, I hear it's a fairly good page rate, and you get to keep your own, you draw in your own style, and you get to keep your ownership of it. That's why I like underground comics." It had nothing to do with the content at all, you know. Although, you know, Jack certainly wasn't a prude, but I think he was just kind of like
Yeah.
shocked. So anyway, I'm taking this seriously. But at the same time, I'm thinking, well, I need to make it clear to him that I'm not, this is in honor of him. So I said, "Jack," he says, "I've got a family. I can't have this." And I said, "Well, you could hang it up on the inside of a closet." I mean, I was really just so clueless. But, you know, the fact that he never, you know, got a police order to keep me away from the house or anything. And years later, he said, he says, "Well, you know, Roz and I were worried about you, but now you're singing with the choir." I said, "Jack, you're Jewish and I'm an atheist. I don't think either of us know anything about choirs." And he's like, "Yeah, but that's the way we used to say it back in New York City." So, you know, but he just laughed it off. So I always think that Jack liked a lot of us young cartoonists out in Southern California because he hadn't been around a lot of young cartoonists since he was working in bullpens when he was. And I think he just kind of dug the fact that we were, you know, too wacky to have very good judgment, but we weren't bad guys. We weren't trying to, you know, do anything genuinely creepy. We were just a little out of control. And one day I was at one of the earliest, it may have been the first one at the El Cortez. So that would have been 1972 or 75. Terry Stroud, a comic dealer, used to own the American Comic Book Company where I worked in Studio City. He brought a big Roman candle fireworks, and the El Cortez was kind of, I always wondered if it was one of the, remember when Bruce Wayne had the big building with the giant atrium back in the 70s in the comics? Anyway, this was kind of like that. So we're surrounded on all four sides by the sides of the El Cortez Hotel. Yep, my friend goes out to talks me into coming along, of course. We're out by the pool and we're about to set off this thing. And Jack walks by and we go, "Come on over, Jack." And he comes on over and he's smoking a cigar. I guess he was not smoking his pipe. He didn't want Ross to see he was smoking a cigar. And we go, "Come on, Jack, light it up." And he kind of bent down and kind of, you could tell he was about to do it. And then he kind of thought, you could see it in his face. It's like, no, this isn't a good idea. And he kind of, "No, boys, but you guys have a good time." He never said, You know, that's not a good idea. You might burn the hotel down. You might get thrown out.
Yeah.
Have a good night, boys, and walk off. And I thought, well, he didn't join, but he's not trying to bust us either. That's pretty cool, you know.
Yeah.
But you know, back then, even the gangs he ran with were kind of like that too. I mean, nobody was carrying a gun; they were just out to beat up the other guy from the next block. I mean, that's almost charming now.
Mm-hmm. And you brought up the San Diego Comic-Con. You're one of the co-founders.
I never use that word founder.
Okay, well, you helped start it.
There was a guy that used the word founder that we never called him the founder, but he told everybody he was the founder, and then everybody thought he was the founder. So I don't do that. I don't even mention it. But I was one of the kids that helped start it.
Okay.
And it was 1969. I graduated high school in 68. And I was working at a B. Dalton bookseller while going to college, and a guy came in who was looking for these children's books that were reprints of Prince Valiant stuff, but instead of using the whole strip, they would just use the illustrations and wrote their own copy so kids could understand it. I told him, I said, well, we're out of them because I already bought them all myself, at a discount, by the way. So he said, oh, well, and this was in the era where, you know, there weren't books on comics in bookstores. There was like a big, huge Dick Tracy book and a big, huge Buck Rogers book. Those are about the only two you could get. And so anyway, we started talking. He said, you know, there's a group of comic fans up on Claremont Mesa that meets once a month. Maybe you'd like to come. I said, sure. So I went, and it was a bunch of guys, mostly younger than me. A couple of them were comic dealers, mail order comic dealers, when Richard Alf and Mike Towery. And Mike now runs the San Diego Comic Fest, and he's had a career outside of fandom in the computer business, but he decided to kind of create a convention that was more like the early Comic Cons. The other guy, Richard Alf, is no longer with us, but he was a comic dealer that even had ads in Marvel and DC Comics. And by 17 or 18, he was wealthy by our standards, and he was not only the first convention runner, but he provided, I think, a little over $2,000. I think it was $2,500, so they could get the hotel, you know, booked. And the third guy was a fellow named Ken Kruger, and Ken was an old comics and science fiction fan, mainly science fiction, really. And he lived in Syracuse, New York, and attended the very first World Science Fiction Convention in '39 in New York City, and was a book dealer and publisher. And you know, when you own your own bookstore back then, apparently it was especially a specialty bookstore like that. Most of his bookstores had a room of pornography in the back. So Ken was very savvy because he always had to stay one step ahead of the police. So he was kind of the smart guy. Richard was the money guy. And the guy that said he was the founder, a guy named Shel Dorf, he had the contacts to the cartoonists. So when the three of us finally combined, plus I went back to my friends at Crawford High. One is Greg Bear, the guy that's a very famous science fiction author now. One of them is John Pound, who did the Garbage Pail Kids for years and tons of stuff for paperbacks. And I know Marvel had him doing a lot of their magazine covers. And some other guys, Roger Friedman, who's a well-known physicist. I mean, but we started intersecting with them, and it was the perfect combination because most of them wanted to just be a collector or a dealer. And most of us wanted to actually get in the business. And Comic-Con wasn't just about comics. It was also much, and we always advertised the fact that it was about science fiction and horror and movies and comic strips and all that. But unfortunately, you know, once Hollywood realized they could buy tables at Comic-Con, it became more about what's next rather than what's from the past that we want to take a look at and appreciate. But you know, Comic-Con hasn't changed that much in terms of our of the goals, but it was very interesting because the first one was mostly boys, almost entirely boys, and moms standing around like this, because we sent out a flyer. I posted at the newsstand I went to. There weren't any comic shops in town yet, and I mean, it looked like a roach motel designed by pedophiles. You know, it was like it was in the basement of the crummiest hotel in downtown San Diego. Hey, come trade comics. To a parent, that sounds pretty fishy, especially in 1970.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been to San Diego Comic-Con. It's just, I mean, it's damn near impossible to get tickets there now. You know what I mean? But I think it's really cool. I didn't even know that. I was like, when I was doing some more research about you, I was like, holy shit! Like, I didn't know he helped start that. You know, like, and you still hit San Diego. I mean, well, obviously not this year, but you still hit it every year, correct?
I'm a special guest. I think not because I'm an important guy, but just out of, you know, here, you were part of this. We're going to acknowledge you. But it makes it much easier because the older I get, the more it's kind of an ordeal just getting around the room and stuff, and forget about the bathrooms. But I did miss one year when I had to have the fractured my ankle severely, and that was really miserable because I was actually got out of the hospital about 2 days before, but I thought there was no way I'm going to be able to handle it, no matter who's pushing me around the room.
Yeah.
So I just didn't do it. But yeah, it's kind of like a high school reunion, except you're actually showing up at a place where you actually have something in common with everybody, and they're going to punch your lights out for, you know, knowing how to pronounce dinosaur names or talking about your favorite funny book or all the things that happened to me in 1959. You know, I was called a weirdo so long. That's the term I like to use. It's kind of like the equivalent of queer. I'm claiming it back. You know, it's like let's all be weirdos.
I'm a weirdo too. So
yeah.
Let's talk about some of your comics now. So your comic work. You co-created Captain Carrot and the Zoo Crew.
Yes, and now DC's killing them.
I know. I don't know what the fuck DC's doing. DC's killing everything, but that's a topic for another conversation.
Well, Warner Brothers killing DC, so it's kind of just down the chain.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask where, and like you talked about like the funny books, you know, the animals and stuff, you know, the funny animal books, right? Like the Disney stuff. So where did the idea for Captain Carrot and the Zoo Crew come from? What was the genesis of that?
Well, as I told you, I worked at this comic shop, which was right down the street from Hanna-Barbera. And we had people that were either working there, dropping in, or people who were trying to sell ideas to him, dropping in. And one of those was Roy Thomas. I think he was trying to pitch some shows. Mm-hmm. Roy would come into the store and we'd yuck it up. And, you know, it was kind of like, I think each of us thought the other one was our captive audience, because Roy likes to talk and I like to talk. So it was great. And I don't know how long it took, but he asked me if I wanted to do a backup story for What If. And that was a reversal of Spider-Man. I forget the exact name, but what if the spider was written by a radioactive human, or something like that. It was called Man Spider. Later, the Marvel created a character who was kind of like mostly spider and partly human called Man Spider. But and this came long before Spider-Ham too. This was in, I don't know, 78 or 79. But anyway, I did it for Roy, and then he left Marvel after Jim Shooter drove him nuts and went over to DC, and he was starting new concepts as well as taking over things like Wonder Woman. And he called me up and he asked me if I wanted to work on developing this thing. So I'd go over to their house, and we came up with a thing called the Just a Lot of Animals. And the Just a Lot of Animals was Super Squirrel, Wonder Wabbit, Bat Mouse, The Crash. I forget all of them. There's a whole page I did. Hawk Moose. I mean, we've got all these characters. Anyway, so we're trying to pitch it to DC, and I did a couple of pages sample art because we were thinking, what if Mighty Mouse was drawn by Jack Kirby and written by Jack Kirby?
Mhm.
What if it didn't have, they were funny animals, but instead of having like Howard the Duck looking like a classic funny animal character, they were funny animals, but they were beefed up and they were done in foreshortening, and they were, you know, you had to kind of take them slightly seriously because they were fighting bad guys. And so but DC said, we want, the more we think about this, the more they feel like just extensions of the brands that they are.
Mhm.
We want new characters that are their own brand. So, okay, no problem. And it turns out, I didn't know this until we were fairly into it, but Roy had actually come up with a Captain Carrot character with a guy named Sam Granger, who I believe lived in North Carolina. And he had been working for Charlton. I think he got into the big ones due to Dick Giordano, but he was an inker at Marvel, but he was also a good cartoonist. He did that thing at Charlton called The Sentinels. It was a backup series that was really good because it was kind of like somebody doing a parody of Steranko, except making it kind of funny looking too. And I thought, man, that's the way I'd like to draw. I always got really excited when the guys that could draw the straight stuff could also draw the funny stuff really well. And Jack was that way. Gene Colan was like that. There were a few of them that really excelled kind of at what I always refer to as walking both sides of the street. And anyway, so I wanted to have a little bit of that in there, but you know, we wanted to draw it as a cartoon because DC made it very clear they wanted to have a show out of this, and that was one of the reasons I got hired. Although I found out later they really didn't want to hire me at all. DC's very snobbish. It was then, certainly is now. And they went to Joe Staton because he was doing Chip, that squirrel.
Oh, the Green Lantern, yeah.
And Joe and I had worked on something for the first Destroyer Duck comic. He did a story about Robert Kanigher, and I inked it. And I had always really liked his stuff because, again, here's a guy that draws the straight stuff but in a funny style. And it was like, yeah, if I just studied it more that way, that's probably how I'd be drawn too.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he told the guys at DC that approached me, he says, no, Scott knows what he's doing. He could do that better than me. He's funnier. Okay, well, great. Thanks, Joe. And we become friends after I found that out. But apparently they also went to some kid that was like just in college. Joe Orlando got involved. And Joe Orlando wound up making these style sheets for me to follow of what he thought they should look like. And they were all really bulked up. And I thought, well, okay, I can do that, but it's not a natural thing. Mine had more of a Hanna-Barbera vibe because I thought the intention was make these characters simple enough to make into cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
But he added all this stuff to the characters, most of them at least, and it was like, I acknowledge some of it. By the way, the only character I came up with completely was Pig Iron, because Roy and I had worked up a bunch of different things kind of based on stuff that he and his wife, Dan, had come up with. But I said, wait a second, we need the big guy. We need the big guy that's always standing in the background so everybody looks good in the foreground. He's like, oh yeah, shit, we do need to do that. So, and I was always a big Wonder Warthog fan, so I thought, well, I don't want to rip off Gilbert Shelton, but I thought of the name. We were doing so many puns. I thought, well, Pig Iron's a term, so let's turn that, inside out.
Yeah.
And then Roy's idea was, well, let's make him Peter Porkchops from the old comics, which I actually read too. I read most of the DC funny animal stuff too. But the Three Mouseketeers was the only one I really liked.
Mm-hmm. And then, going back to like how I discovered your work, another, kind of a funny animal, which was the Sonic the Hedgehog book that Archie got the license for. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that time. I know that the animated series came out around the same time that the book launched. I was wondering if you could just talk about your time then, and then did you come up with the characters like Princess Sally, or was that from the show? And then you.
Yeah, I was actually, I'd started working for Ogilvy and Mather, big ad agency, and I was doing all those commercials with the Flintstones, characters that really got me going as a cartoonist, by the way. And so a fellow named Paul Castiglia called me, who I'd met at Comic-Con, and he really kept talking about the fact that I was like the guy that did funny animals, in his opinion at the time, the best. Not that many people new guys were doing that sort of material. You had it in the Gold Key comics and Harvey comics, but not anywhere else. And so he approached me, and I wasn't a gamer, but I said, well, send me a drawing of the character. And I looked at Sonic and I went, I really like Felix the Cat, and he looks a lot like Felix the Cat. I didn't even know that the creator intended for him to look like Felix the Cat, but I definitely got the message because he was round and angular, and I like that combination. I like edges and points on things because it's a nice, just artistically, it's a nice contrast with the circular stuff. I think that's why Sonic's kind of like, well, you know, Mickey was based on Felix, and Sonic kind of like gets revenge by combining both of them. So he's more popular than Mickey now. But anyway, I agreed to do it because I thought I'd have fun doing it. And the show had already been, was in production for ABC, and that was through a company called DIC. DIC stands for Do It Cheaper. And I wound up, I'd already actually worked for them because I produced their John Candy series, Camp Candy.
Okay.
And I kind of, you know, was in it. But this was going to be dealing with Archie, not them. But I got the model sheets, and Deke had already screwed it up because they had a Sonic with 3 fingers. And I didn't know this until, I don't know, 10 years ago, but if you have a character with 3 fingers, and I think Mickey and the Disney character is the only ones they'll let get away with, but in Japan, it's considered very offensive to show anybody without 5 fingers.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
If you're missing a finger, it shows that you're a member of the Yakuza, right? Or the Yakuza, I don't know how you pronounce it. And if you have an extra finger, a lot of people had that problem after the war because of the radiation. There were a lot of mutations over there. No superpowers, just bad mutations. By the way, where is it? I got to show you this. Oh, come on. Oh, yeah, here. Spider-Man pasta. And they're saying, so hot, it's practically radioactive. Kids.
That's such a ad ad.
Yeah, what the hell? It's like, what, you know, I worked in advertising, so I hated seeing stuff like that. It's like, you don't need to reference. Like, the kids aren't, now they're going to go out and break into a lab and eat the radioactive material. Anyway, what was I talking about? I was
Sonic.
Yeah, they gave me the model sheets from DIC, and the storyline was a lot more military and Star Wars-y than I expected. If you read those comics, they even had those guards that kind of were supposed to look like stormtroopers, and all sorts of things in there. But fortunately, I worked with a writer who was actually funny, and he'd do the layouts because he was a cartoonist too. And then I'd take those layouts and try to make them even funnier. And but the thing was, I had the job at the ad agency, and it was hard to keep. Plus, it was hard to keep up having that job. But it was also hard because they sent me all the different platforms with all the Sonic games available, and wondered why I was late. Well, of course, I'm there suddenly addicted to playing video games. I'm just like, so I was late on them. So I just finally said, you know, I'll do the cover for the 3rd one. I did 3 and then that one. So I did my time in the barrel. I did a couple of stories from them later. But the problem with that is they never told me that these were going to be all used as at least the first issue, number 0.
Mm-hmm.
It was all going to be used as advertising, as giveaways at Toys R Us. You may have even gotten one of those. They printed those in the millions. And they were all, there wasn't on cover stock. It was like interior pulp paper. And they did a 16-page version and an 8-page version that were all my art. And I'd never signed, they didn't ask me to sign any kind of release. And at the time, when I was working for the ad agency, I was doing ads like, and this is essentially ads, right?
Yeah.
I was being paid. Now, this isn't a brag. It just shows you how incredible, how much money they're throwing around in advertising. And this was like, in what, 1992 or something?
Mm-hmm.
I was getting $10,000 a page. I was getting more than if I'd drawn 4 comic books just for one drawing. But it meant the reason they're expensive, you got to put up with all the BS of advertising and the the product, people from the product, people from the characters. So it's a big involved thing. So usually I had to draw it overnight because nobody could get an answer until the very last minute. And I was the only artist in town that Bill Hanna said, if he draws it, it's approved. So it worked out for me, but I'm just saying it was, I felt like I'd been cheated because here they asked me to do this initially and I didn't even know that it was for the sake of advertising.
Right.
I don't think that was Paul Castiglia's idea, but I've approached them many times to say, I really need a little royalty on this. They just laugh. They just laugh.
Yeah, that's shitty, man.
Well, Jack Kirby once said, or somebody once said, don't get in comics, kid. They'll break your heart.
Yeah.
And now DC is executing Captain Carrot, and Marvel just reprinted that Man Spider story I did in one of those recent What If collections, and I called them. I said, "Where's my royalty?" And I must have called them a year ago, and I keep. Oh yeah, well you'll be on its way. I don't expect to get more than $45 or something, but I don't care. Why should Marvel get it instead of me?
I 100% agree with that. And that, like you said, it happened back then and it continues on now,
Well, that's why guys learn to get good and then they go and become independents.
Yeah.
They lose their shirts trying to publish their own comics.
Yeah.
That's the saddest thing is I'm sure there's so many good comics out there that I've never looked at because I love the fact that if I go into a really well-stocked store like yours, I'm going to see everything, but it becomes white noise almost immediately.
Yeah. It's hard. There's so much content out there. It's like, and it gets drowned out sometimes, you know what I mean, by other stuff.
Well, especially because now, DC and Marvel were always competitive until the distributor essentially distributed both companies, and because DC was with them longer, they can only have 8 titles a month.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not even working in comics much anymore, and I can see it's like a battle. How many of our titles can we get on the shelves to block out your titles? And it's not like every character that ever existed has his own title now. There's like an orbiting 3 or 4 mini titles going around. Oh, no, this is his best friend, and this is his enemy, and this is his teacher. And it's like, I used to be a completist and on everything. And I finally gave up years ago because it was like, I just can't do it. But it was a fraction of what's out there now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard for me to like want to support too. Like you're saying, it's not even different characters. You got like 6 Spider-Man books. You got like 8 Batman, and then if you include the stuff that's related to it, probably like 12 titles. And it's like, and then you got the X-Men line, the new one that just started. They were double shipping it every month, so it was like 12 X books a month. I'm like, dude, you're not only are you flooding the market again with basically. It's pretty much like one title or one group of characters, right, but you're leaving it so that people don't have money to go try other stuff. because comic books aren't cheap. You know, if you think about what you actually get, they're $4 a comic. You know, like, and then the economy's not great now either. And then like they got this Empire miniseries that's coming out every single week. Yeah, I don't know. It's just a shit show with Marvel and DC. There are things I like from them still, but it's very little compared to like, I think the majority of what I'm reading now is like indie stuff. And then I'm just going back and buying like old comics. You know, I find myself I don't just have the nostalgia for them. I enjoy them more. You know, it's not just nostalgia. I actually enjoy reading them more than I enjoy reading the crap that I see now.
You know, every generation of cartoonist is influenced by the generation of cartoonists they read stuff by.
Mm-hmm.
I'm lucky because I grew up in the 50s and 60s where there were no guys from fandom drawing comics. It was all guys that had studied or gone to art school or had worked with really good professionals till they got at least decent.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, there were very few incompetent comics being produced professionally that you get on the spinner rack when I was a kid. So, you know, I'm copying guys that were at the top of their game, like Kirby and Barks and Gilbert Shelton and Underground Comics. I mean, all that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Underground Comics actually was the first group of people that came in that weren't professional, that were actually doing interesting stuff. But as far as mainstream stuff, you look at the comics now, it's all by kids who were influenced by 1990s comics.
Yeah.
And that's not a put down intentionally, but you know, in the 1990s, everybody was fighting for more books. They were hiring people. They'd lost the guys to Image. Mm-hmm. So if somebody could draw kind of like Todd McFarlane, you've got a job. Well, you know, being able to kind of ape somebody's style, but it looks like mostly swipes or the characters just don't have any acting or appeal. And it's like, I look at that every one of these what ifs. I go, oh, it's an interest. No, it's not. You know, and it's like, these are the books that those kids are like looking at and tracing to sell to their friends for $1.50 for a head and $3 for the body. You know, prices have gone up in school too. So.
So I know, like, you also, I don't want to like gloss over this, but I know you also worked at Bongo, which I think you won a couple Eisners for some of your work over there. I was wondering if you could just briefly, because I want to get into a little bit of your animation stuff too, if you could just talk about your time at Bongo and stuff like that.
I loved working at Bongo because Bill Morrison was the editor. I didn't work on the earliest stuff, but I came in when he asked me to do something for the follow-up to the Radioactive Man series, the 6-issue series. They did a parody of DC's 80-page Giants. This was the 80-page Colossal. And they wanted a story about Radioactive 8, who I think had been mentioned once on the cartoon show. And I was a big Simpsons fan. I don't know who wasn't. But I said, yeah, Radioactive 8, that's my idea of fun because of the Oddball Comics. And so I did that. And they'll start asking me for more and more stuff. And I absolutely loved doing it. And Bill was one of the saner editors I've ever worked for. He understood stuff. If he gave me a note, it was something that made sense. It wasn't just, you know, oh, let's see all this from a different view kind of thing. And when I started writing, I started writing my own material too. So that was where I kind of, you know, Captain Carrot stuff, I look back and it's overwritten and it's got too many puns. The Simpsons stuff, because I knew the characters and knew their voices and knew how they would sound in real life, I think my writing is funnier on them. And it went on great, and then Bill left, and the new editor said, you just do those nostalgia stories. I thought, well, yeah, some of them, because Bill liked those, but okay. And I sent him a bunch of premises, and he said, I didn't ask for these. And that was the last I ever heard from him. So much for Bongo.
Yeah, and they're not even around anymore. So
No, but that was the same guy that didn't ask Sergio to keep doing his comic either. So that's great. That's great judgment,
So let's talk about animation. I was wondering if you could kind of discuss how you approach working in that as opposed to how you approach your work in comics, because I know it's a completely different thing, right?
Well, I was working at that comic shop, which was a mile away from Hanna-Barbera, and I was still working there when Marvel got the license to do the line of Hanna-Barbera comic books.
Mm-hmm.
Charlton had been producing them, but the art and stories were so bad that they were getting complaints from overseas publishers saying, we'd like to reprint these, but they look like shit. And we're in Europe where people appreciate a well-drawn comic and we just can't use these. Mm-hmm. So they started one through Marvel, and Marvel started hiring guys that worked on the cartoons. And I hadn't worked on any of their cartoons yet. And I had actually interviewed there the year before and was told, you're not ready, because I mainly had samples from Underground Comics. And so the head, the first editor was a guy named Chase Craig, and he hired me to be an inker. And then Mark Evanier took over when Chase just realized he'd rather retire completely. And Mark was giving me assignments as writer and inker and a penciler, and they were not my best work, certainly, but I was starting to kind of figure things out, having those kind of challenges. So one day I'm doing that pretty much full time. I was actually drawing a lot of that stuff in the back room of the comic shop I managed. So that kind of interesting. It went from being a blank piece of paper to a back issue, all at the same address. But I got a call from Hanna-Barbera one day, and they asked me, they said, we hear that we know your work that you've been doing on the comics. We like it. We wonder if you'd like to work at the studio. And I thought, well, I don't know. I said, I'm freelancing now, and I can kind of get up whenever I want. I don't want to put pants on. I don't have to, Like, wee. And they said, well, we are doing a new Flintstone series. I said, well, when do I start? Because when the Flintstones hit, I was 9. I was a paleontology nut, and my dad looked like Fred Flintstone. It was like I was there for the very first episode. I had to campaign with my parents to cancel my accordion lessons so I could see the Flintstones. I mean, it was always a big tent pole to me. So, yeah, of course. So I go over there, and I'm just like looking around and so delighted. I've got all these old cartoonists whose work I knew just from the the credits of shows, and guys from other studios too. I mean, it was like a stocked pond where you take your kid to go fishing, and that way they can make sure they get one.
Yeah.
Almost everybody there was a seasoned professional, because Bill and Joe I always kind of consider them kind of like Stan Lee, a lovable scoundrel, It's like, as long as they're not doing it to you, they're lovable. But they like to help their friends and the guys that worked for them. I mean, Bill and Joe were approaching 80, I think, when I started there. And they even showed loyalty to me. I was never fired once from that place, when guys more experienced than me would be shown the door because they were training me. Mm-hmm. They couldn't figure out why I loved old Hanna-Barbera, because I don't think even they did that much. But they did like the fact that I really was into it, was always asking them questions, and give me different assignments, and I'd figure out how to do it. And then they were getting their money's worth, but so was I. It was kind of like working for Roger Corman, but better.
Yeah.
Anyway, I worked there and enjoyed it very much, and made a lot of these friends that I'm still friends with. But then I was offered the Captain Carrot thing, so I left for a while. And when that finally was over, I worked for a studio, an animation studio that didn't really exist. It was shut down by the Security Exchange Commission before they ever made a film. So that was kind of interesting. My friend Floyd Norman said, who covered the Watts riots with Walt Disney's brother's camera, He said, it was like a white version of the Watts riots. Anyway, after that, I got lots of interviews because it was just a crazy place and everybody in town, it was down in Irvine. So everybody's like, what the hell was going on down there? That's how I got the job on Muppet Babies at Marvel Productions. And then I started producing some commercials there, freelance for them while I was working on the Muppet Babies. And then the show went on a hiatus and they had me work on the show Gem. You know, the fashion model looked like a hooker from outer space.
Oh, Gem and the Holograms, right.
And I was just completely unable to do it. I'd been drawing characters that were like 2 heads tall, and these characters were 12 heads tall. I'm not kidding, I couldn't even fit one of my drawings of Gem into a storyboard panel because I just was not wired to draw humans. I mean, I've always been a funny guy. I probably could do it now, but I sure couldn't do it then after almost nothing but Muppet Babies and Flintstones. So I went back to Hanna-Barbera, and I was the main designer on the show called The Snorks. It was a kind of an imitation of the Smurfs underwater. They were originally supposed to be from outer space. That's how devoted these guys are when they're pitching their ideas. Like, oh yeah, we could change it, you know. That's how a lot of those old shows even got started. They'd try to sell The Thing and the Shmoo, and they'd say, well, we don't know. We like The Thing and the Shmoo, and Joe Barbera go, okay, we'll combine them. We'll put them in a show together, whether it made sense or not. So you probably wondered that a lot about a lot of the stuff when you were growing up. Anyway, I became a writer and then a producer at Hanna-Barbera. And I'd never produced a show in my life, but guess I handled it okay. I almost had a nervous breakdown at times, but it was called the Completely Mental Misadventures of Ed Grimley. And that had the whole staff, almost all the people in SCTV were doing voices, and they were coming in and we were doing them, and including Jonathan Winters. And Jonathan was one of my first big heroes. People out there don't know who that is. He was a comedian in the 50s and 60s who was just almost all improv and completely like he was getting it from another dimension. He was kind of, Robin Williams was his big, he was the guy that admired him the most, but really Jonathan's old first stuff reminds me more of Jim Carrey when he was doing stand-up, where it's like, what dimension are you pulling that up? So it was a real thrill to work on it, but it was very, very taxing. And I did that for 1 season, and then I got apparently Martin Short told John Candy that I pulled the show out of the trash for him because he wasn't happy with the early ones, but I came up with a way to make them much more acceptable to Mr. Short. So I guess I found this out years later. They also, this was for Deke, not Hanna-Barbera, and I found out later, and I know this is true, they hired me because at the time I weighed over 400 pounds, and I think they wanted John to be comfortable with a guy that was a big fat guy too. And the funny thing is, it was true. I had to come, I hired all these guys. It was one of these shows that was bought really late, so I had to kind of come up with what does John look like as a cartoon character. So, you know, I mean, I know lots of cartoonists, and so I just called up all the guys I thought would have very different styles. I said, give me $500 worth of drawings of John Candy, just sketches. Okay. So I thought, okay, with 20 people, I've got it made. John's going to say he likes one of them. He hated every one. They all drew him like an avalanche, you know. I mean, it was just not kind. And I go home, and I'm like beating my brains out, like, geez, what am I going to do? It's up to me now to come up with the answer, and we have to start handing out scripts to storyboard right away. My wife says, why don't you just draw him the way you draw yourself on your business card? I always kind of drew myself as Fred Flintstone with, you know, a body that looked more like a potato, you know. So it's like, yeah, you get it. This is a fat guy, but it's a cute fat rather than a morbid fat, right? So I did. And he goes, this is it. This is the greatest. And I thought, you know, I didn't know at the time, but I guess it's true. As a big fat guy, I understood how I like to be seen as a cartoon, and that's exactly what he wanted to be seen as. And we got along great. We became friends. He was a comic collector. After we did that show, I quit after the first season because the network was driving me crazy, and he insisted I be paid as the producer. But I really would just be giving my opinion on everything. I wasn't in the thick of it. So second season didn't look as good even as the first, which was a shame. But then they did a third without me, used some of my story ideas without paying me. But after that, John wanted me. The last time I saw John in person, we were having a meeting with John Hughes. Is that his name? Yeah, John Hughes, who did all his movies.
The Breakfast Club.
He wanted me to take John's characters from SCTV and some new ones and produce and direct a bunch of shorts that would go out with every John Hughes, John Candy movie. And it was like, oh, this is great. And then John got involved with that hockey team. And then he died down in Mexico. So none of that ever happened. But I've worked with a lot of celebrities. And I got to say, I like being around John more than any of them. And this isn't a slight. I mean, Gary Owens was also terrific. But John, as far as a real true celebrity, he could have been your trash man and you would have liked him just as much. That had nothing to do with, he was, no pun, he was genuinely sweet. He loved people. He wasn't doing it for the money. He was just a good guy. And I miss him a lot. I really do.
Yeah, I mean,
his warmth really came across on screen.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But it was even better in person because it was so genuine. He wasn't doing it from a script.
Yeah, I mean, his films are a huge part of my childhood. You know what I mean? Because even if they came out, because I was born in '87, even if they came out before I was born, I still watched them as a kid. I mean, he was in Home Alone, the first one, and I mean, even my daughter watches that movie, and you can just see like. His delivery, his comedic timing was great. His just personality was great in all of his movies. Uncle Buck, all that stuff, you know.
His stuff never felt forced.
No, never felt.
That was the best part, and it never felt like an actor was doing it either. It was like he just walked in. Oh, hey, I'm that guy today. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, he had a very his sense of humor was never mean spirited.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, you know, you've been involved in comics and for a long time. You've seen the industry go through so many various ups and downs. I wanted to ask your personal opinion. You've kind of touched on it a little bit about what the industry's missing that we don't see anymore, but I just wanted to get your opinion on what you think we need to see in order for the industry to thrive and survive, especially with the state of the world and the industry. Like, we're seeing so much really drastic changes just in the last like 4 or 5 months, especially at the big publishers. So I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Well, I'd say first of all, stop making all your comics about a big disaster. We've already got one. I mean, where's the relief or interest or fun? Make comics fun again. Let's get a hat that says that, because comics are not fun for anybody now.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you can still have guys trying to destroy the world, but the tones, the coloring, everything. I mean, it's just like, everything looks like chaos now when you go into a comic shop and you actually look at the individual covers. I think they need to start understanding that you can't be courting the diehard fan, because we've become the primary audience.
Mm-hmm.
And that's dangerous, because being a geek, we've had that phase now for way too long, but one of these days something horrible is going to come along with some, you know, comic collector that has a stack of dead nurses in his basement next to his collection, and suddenly nobody will ever want to admit they like this stuff. Or like the Batman, whatever, the Black Label. Granny buys one. Hey, my Jimmy likes this comic. He loves Batman. Hey, Granny, what's this? Ah, I mean, it's like comics are always kind of on the edge of anything everywhere because they're trying too hard to be edgy now.
Mhm.
And quite honestly, even the word fuck no longer gets a second glance. And I'm not a conservative at all. I'm as crazy liberal as you can get, but I think the comic business has lost a sense of judgment. And now it's kind of like, let's make everything dark and more outrageous than the last because that'll get attention. You know what would get attention? Some stuff where you could take a kid in there and say, hey, here, want a Superman comic? I mean, if the writers and the artists are good, but they lack clarity, I think. I don't think they tell a story as well as they should. But, you could make this stuff as genuinely real as you want if you just learned a few tricks from the way people were writing the big movies in the 1940s and 50s. And as an adult, you watch those now and you go, I didn't realize this was about abortion or, that this character was gay. I mean, it's like, they knew how to do it in a subtle way that everybody could pick it up and get a different story out of it. But it wasn't aimed just at one audience. That's why they were subtle about those things. It was censorship, sure, but on the other hand, the movie still came out and that information and message was still in it if you were aware of the world and how things work. And I wish that more writers would do stuff like that. Like Will Eisner was a great example. I mean, in 8 pages, he could do a story that was the Spirit wasn't really about the Spirit. It was an anthology series about people in trouble. And he was just kind of the guy that might try to help them, but oftentimes failed. But, things worked out or didn't. Obviously, not everybody can be a Will Eisner, but I think that there's no appeal in showing people characters or situations where everybody looks like they're doomed all the time. I mean, at least Marvel has it used to be a lot more pronounced, but at least Marvel has a few books that are a little more fun or projects. I think Squirrel Girl's gone, right? And
It ended, yeah. But that's a great example, I think.
I love those books. And I once in a while, they'll just do something that's a little mini series or something that's fun. I mean, even DC, Dan DiDio, who I think has overseen an awful lot of bad news in comics, has been writing that new Metal Men book, and it's actually fun and readable and everything.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only reason I'm buying the alternate copies, because they've got art by guys my age that remember when the Metal Men were really charming and fun. This isn't as fun and goofy, but it's still, compared to the rest of the stuff, it's fun.
Yeah.
I just don't read that much new stuff anymore because I just think it's all in the wrong direction. It's not a matter of me boycotting it or, although I got to admit, this new thing with Captain Carrot, what really bothered me is that Art Adams drew that cover. And Art Adams' first published work in comics was in an issue of Captain Carrot. And Art, if you're seeing this, I'm not mad at you, but if I'd been offered that to do for an issue of Walt Disney's Comics and Stories, and I could have gotten away with it, I would have said, no, I don't think so. I love this one.
Yeah.
Just me.
But I mean, I know you said there's not very many books that you are following nowadays just because of you're not getting what you would like out of the comics. What books? I mean, I do your polls, but for those people listening, what books or creators are you kind of excited about that are coming out?
I really like the Black Hammer books.
Yeah.
I really like those because, if you're an old fart like me, you understand the references, but if you don't, it doesn't matter. They're kind of iconic types anyway.
Right.
And it's got that kind of dark, bleak tone, but it's still kind of funny too. I mean, it has a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
And I like that. I mean, I'll tell you somebody whose work I always like. I just did something for his new collection of Dream Comics, is Rick Veitch. When Rick was doing the Swamp Thing, and then he started doing his own stuff, he was like me. He was an underground comic guy, although he never worked in underground comics, but his brother did, of all things. But he approached everything like it was an underground comic. You know, okay. My favorite thing ever was he went Roy Raymond TV Detective, which was a feature in detective comics all through the 50s. And it was, I remember when I was a kid, got on in like 58, it's like, TV detective, then why isn't he, you know, look like Peter Gunn or something? You know, it's like, no, it was just a big novelty to be on TV apparently when it was started.
Mm-hmm.
But he had Roy Raymond driving around town with a chauffeured limousine that was full of trash because he was become a hoarder, and all of his food, and apparently he was shitting in this, I mean, you know, they made it like he never left the car. I thought, God, so for somebody to corrupt an old DC character that nobody cares about, that's pretty funny.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if it was Captain Carrot, I'm sure I'd feel differently. But anyway, I like it when people can come in and take the pieces and turn them around in a way that doesn't depress you, but it's fun. But you're right, the independents have more of that stuff, and I'm trying to open myself up to it more. I read some Umbrella Academies recently.
Yeah, it's really good.
And I really like those. And then I read the one, Not Connected, by the same men, about the guy that keeps dying over and over.
Day Tripper.
Day Tripper. And I got really depressed reading it.
Yeah, that's a heavy one. Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I kind of went away going, boy, this is beautifully produced and written, but it's like,
Yeah.
well, here's a dozen unhappy endings for you.
Yeah.
So I don't really understand what the point of it was, other than it's kind of like, you can think life's working out for you, but guess what?
Yeah. And then before we get out of here, I have one more question. And then what projects are you working on right now?
I'm finishing up a children's book that I'm illustrating. It's a sequel to one I did a few years ago. And this one's called Marine Lagoon 2. And it's not my concept or story, but I've been helping out with the art and the character designs, and it's privately published, so it's kind of I don't know if you'll be able to find it in your store. Hopefully you can get it on Amazon. But it's mostly drawn and written, where I'm just kind of supervising the pre-production on it now. But I'm going to be starting next week, I guess. On I was working on a Garbage Pail Kids game. And it's out, and it's like an app game, and it's interesting because, you know, I like I said, I went to high school with John Pound, and he designed and painted most of those cards, and we're using the cards. We're actually animating the characters on the cards.
Oh, that's cool.
Up with a process where we can give the, you know, even though they're just drawn from one angle, we can take all those pieces, isolate them, and give them depth by rounding off the front and then moving them around kind of like a paper doll would.
Mm-hmm.
And they look pretty damn good because they're not really animated, but we can cheat it so they do. And each one, that way, one's firing snot at the other one, who's shooting fish at the other one. I mean, you know, it's not exactly them, because they're all stuck on their cards at the same time. But I designed the whole thing beyond it, because they have to have buildings and different weapons and all that stuff. And I'm going to be working on that too.
Awesome.
And let me see well, I'm still working on my Oddball Comics book, which we don't have a date for it yet. Between the tariff laws and the pandemic, I don't think we have a deadline, but it's my 200-page full-color book on the history of all the comics that nobody ever heard of, for a good reason.
And so do you have any idea when that's possible? Are you going to self-publish, Kickstarter? What's
No, Tomorrow's is doing it.
Okay.
But it was going to be out this year, but I decided to redo the whole book because I thought, well, if I have this much time, Why not? And you know, you know, this was kind of a genre that I kind of created, where you're taking all the covers and reinterpreting them from a distance. But an awful lot of people have been putting stuff out like this over the years. So I figured the one way I can do this differently, I'm putting a lot of cartoons by myself in there as well, introducing them, talking about them, pointing different things. So it's really stuff that only a cartoonist, I think, is going to notice. So that will help too.
Awesome. I'll definitely be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, I'll finally have an excuse to come sign something at the store.
Yeah, I definitely want a signed copy. That's for sure. But you know, before you throw out your plugs, I just want to, you know, thank you again for doing this. It's really been a privilege and an honor to be able to sit here and chat with you today. And yeah, could you just tell everyone watching, listening, where they can find you online?
I'm on shawcartoons.com. It's got a little hyphen between the Shaw and cartoons, and I've got tons of examples there. I also have a page on Facebook called exclamation pointed, and that also, every day I find something out of my an unreasonably vast collection of old art that I've done. I'm even finding stuff online that I forgot I ever drew. So you can see that on Facebook. So those are the two main things to find me. I don't really use Twitter or any of the other things too much.
You're not missing anything on Twitter, Scott. You're not missing anything. All it is negative. The only reason I'm even on there is I need it to promote. You know what I mean? Like, and that's the extent of my journey on Twitter, because the negative energy, I don't need that. You know, I don't think anybody really needs it.
I use Twitter when I'm about to go to a convention.
Yeah.
Not the only time.
Yeah. All right, cool, man. Well, thank you again. And maybe let's do another one when Oddball Comics is going to come out.
And I'll tell you about the time that Joe Shuster came to our pot party.
Oh my God! Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, on that note, let's end it. That's a good ending. Thanks again, dude.
All right. Thanks very much.
Have a good one.
Okay. You too.